Hi, everyone. I'd like to introduce to you Lesing, who I met 3 years ago at Melbourne University, where he was doing research into something very interesting about bees as part of his PhD. And in the meantime, he's actually obtained his PhD. And this is sort of a presentation of the research that he did in order to finish his PhD. So thank you, Leslie. Over to you.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm happy to be back and excited to share a bit of what I found in my PhD. So yes, I recently finished that in December. And as you can see, the general theme of my PhD was time sense, or how an insect with such a tiny brain might experience time. So I think time sense to us humans is pretty intuitive. It's pretty easy for us to be aware of the passing of time. And that's because we're a very strange species that is really obsessed with time. In fact, we live our entire lives according to time schedules, and we invent many tools to help us do this. However, if we strip away all of these clocks and gadgets, we can find that our brain actually is really good at tracking the passing of time, and that this mechanism is really, really complicated to the point that even to this day, we still don't really know the full story of how it all works in the human brain. Now, when we study time sense, we actually split it into two categories. So on the left, you have what we call interval timing, which is timing at really short time scales. You can think of in the seconds to minutes. I like to think of it like a stopwatch. And that's compared to circadian timing on the right. And that simply is to do with circadian rhythms. I'm sure many of you have heard of that. It helps to time events that occur at long time scales, and you can think of it like a clock. And the interesting thing is, we know that in humans, we do have different mechanisms for timing short time scales and timing long time scales. But how does this all work in non-human animals? This is a really interesting question for animals with brains very different to humans, especially bees. And in fact, for insects, it's only really been looked at in a handful of insect species, including honeybees and bumblebees. I think that's because, well, honeybees are really easy to work with compared to some other insects. But also, I think a lot of people have always had interest in bees, and we like to think about how they might experience the world around them. The story of time sense is actually really interesting in bees. So it all started with a man called Professor Auguste Forel, and he made some observations that every morning his honeybees would be joining him for breakfast at the same time every day. And he found that even on days when he didn't bring marmalade, which was what the bees were attracted to, or when he stayed indoors, he would still see the bees come out to his porch every day at the same time. And this is, I believe, the very first recorded observation where bees seem to be able to learn to visit a specific place at a specific time. And we call this time memory. Later on in 1928, Dr. Ingeborg Belling, she formally tested this time memory idea by training bees to come out to a sugar feeder at the same time every day. And she found that even when she removed the feeder, the bees would still come out to find the feeder at the same time. And this really confirmed past anecdotal evidence, but it really raised the next question, which was, how are the bees actually doing this? Do they have an internal clock that they're using, or are they basing their decisions off observations such as the sunlight or external cues such as that? Dr. Belling repeated the experiment in a dark room and found that even in darkness, the bees would still walk to a feeder at the same time every day. And she showed that it wasn't the sunlight which the bees were relying on. it was potentially some sort of internal clock they were using. Not only that, but the clock seemed to be really precise at a 24-hour cycle. So I think she tried training them to different cycles, like a 19-hour cycle, but that didn't work out very well. Specifically, it had to be around 24 hours. In response to this, Dr. Oscar Wilde, he repeated the experiment again because a lot of people were quite skeptical of the previous studies. They thought, well, maybe the bees, sure, they're not processing the sunlight. Maybe there's some sort of invisible cue that they're using to keep track of the time. So in retaliation, Dr. Weil, he conducted this experiment underground in a salt mine to control for many cues such as temperature, illumination, humidity, anything that he could think of. And yet again, the bees, they behaved in the same way. They came out from the hive and they visited the feeder at the same time every day. But scientists are notoriously skeptical, and some people were still not convinced. They thought, well, what if bees were measuring something strange like the rotation of the Earth? Finally, the mystery was solved in 1955 by Dr. Max Renner. So he conducted a really elegant jet lag experiment. And the premise was that you can only be affected by jet lag if you have an internal circadian clock. What he did was he first trained the bees to visit a feeder at 8:30 p.m. Paris time, and then he flew his bees on a plane to New York to see what would happen. And this is a really nice picture of him listening to his hive. Back then, it was fine to take your bees on hand carry on a plane, and they survived. And eventually, he found that they came out 5 hours earlier at 3:30 local time instead of 8:30, which showed that the bees did actually get jet lag and they were running on Paris time. That was consistent to if they had an internal circadian rhythm. He also showed that if he moved the hive outside, the bees would gradually recover from the jet lag and reset their clock with the sun. Nowadays, circadian timing is really well known to play an important role in the foraging relationships between bees and flowers. For example, flowers produce nectar and release scents at specific times of the day, and bees, they have foraging patterns and activities that follow circadian patterns. Bees can also learn the temporal patterns of flowers so as to efficiently exploit this nectar food resource. All that history was about circadian timing, which I mentioned works like a clock. But what about the other type of timing? So my PhD was actually more interested in interval timing, how animals are able to keep track of time in the seconds to minutes timescale. This sort of timing is usually studied in the lab using highly controlled experiments. We call these fixed interval experiments, but that's just a fancy way of saying we train animals to learn different food schedules which work on a fixed time schedule. What this would look like is you have this rat in a box, and there would be a food schedule of, let's say, 15 seconds. So every 15 seconds, if the animal pushes a button, they would find a food reward. If they pushed it too early, then there would be no reward. So, of course, at the start, the animal wouldn't know what's going on. They would just push the button randomly. But if they have a time sense, eventually they will be able to realize that there is a time schedule here, and the responses they make will start to become closer to each interval. So eventually, after a lot of training, the rat will push the lever every 15 seconds roughly. So using this sort of protocol, we actually have tested a lot of different mammals, birds. A lot of these, I'd say, have been found to have interval timing, and that's because they're really easy to train. So there might be some bias there. For fish, I believe only one fish has found evidence for interval timing, so that's goldfish. They've tested two reptiles, king snake and a turtle, and in both cases, they couldn't find any evidence so far. So that's pretty interesting. For insects, there've been only about 3 studies on interval timing. So the first of which is this really nice experiment by Boisford and Sherry. They worked on bumblebees, and they basically trained bumblebees to a food schedule, so a 6-second short food schedule, and they also trained them to a long 36-second food schedule. The experiment works very similar to what I described before, but instead of a button, the bee would enter this box, they would enter this chamber, and then they would have to poke their proboscis into a hole, which breaks an infrared sensor, and that would be equivalent to pushing a button. So every, let's say, 6 seconds, if the bee pushes the button, it would get food. And eventually, they found that the bees would actually wait. The amount of time they would wait before sticking their proboscis into the hole roughly matched their interval length. This was actually really groundbreaking because it was the very first study to suggest that bees or any insect could actually have this interval timing capacity. I later discovered that they repeated this bumblebee experiment twice in honeybees, but for some reason, we've found no evidence that honeybees could do this. So we weren't able to replicate this at all in honeybees. This is really surprising because you would think time would be super important for a bee to keep track of when efficiently foraging. Of course, there are differences between bumblebee and honeybee cognition, but in the general sense, they're both incredibly smart animals. So it was really surprising to me that honeybees couldn't be trained to learn this sort of experiment. And so I decided to have a go in my PhD to look at this question. And I decided to try and answer this question in a different sort of way. So in 2019, I designed an experiment with LED lights, and I simply wanted to know if bees could be trained to tell the difference between different durations of light. I chose 1 second and 3 seconds. So what actually happened was the bee would fly into a presentation chamber. I would show them either 1 or 3 seconds duration of light, and then I would release them, and they would have to fly to either a square or a circle shape. So for example, I might associate a 1 second duration light with a square, and if the bee flies to the square, I would reward it with a sugar reward. If she flies to the wrong choice, she would find a bitter quinine solution, which they find doesn't taste very good, so they don't really like that. And I basically trained them on this task for about 4 to 5 hours and record each of their choices to see if they improved over time. If they could tell the difference between 1 and 3 seconds, they would be able to apply this information to help them choose the correct shape. As a baseline to compare with, I also trained them to a color task. So I trained them to tell the difference between blue and yellow, and then had them associate those colors with a specific shape. I knew the bees could do this, so it was a nice point of comparison for me, and it was a good baseline learning level. This is the actual apparatus. So that's the LED light tunnel on the left. It's housed in a wooden box so that it would be nice and dark inside and wouldn't attract other bees to the experiment. Here's some videos of what it would look like. So the bee flies inside the tunnel, and then I activate the light. In this case, it's the color task. the bee flies out. And then she will have to make a choice. So here she chose the square. And this goes on for hours and hours and hours. So this is quickly a graph of my results. The red line is the control, the color condition, and the blue is the time condition. What we want to see is a line that slopes upwards, indicating that the amount of choices they made that were correct increased over time. So you can see in the red line, which is the color condition, we see that they actually could learn because they improved over time. It slopes upwards. But for the time condition, it's quite a flat line. So I didn't actually see any evidence for learning. So they did not seem to tell the difference between the 1 and the 3 second durations of light. Very interesting results to me because it wasn't really what I expected. I thought that the bees would be able to do this, but it got me back to the drawing board. I thought, well, maybe I'm asking the question in the wrong way. Maybe bees might not be very good at timing the duration of light because it's not so important to their daily lifestyle. So I thought, when might learning different durations actually be important? Well, of course, honeybees well known for their waggle dance. And in the waggle dance, they have a specific component of the dance called the waggle phase. And it's the part when the bee is vigorously moving side to side in the middle portion. So the duration of this waggle portion has been found to strongly correlate to distance to the flower. So what we think is that the bees are using the duration of their waggling to tell each other how far they need to fly to find the food source. In other words, it seems that they are able to pay close attention to the time of each dance or aspects of the dance. And they could do this in a vibration signal. So that got me thinking, well, if bees are doing this already, but with a vibration cue, why not try and train them and see if they can actually tell the difference between different durations of vibrations? I thought, well, maybe this would be way easier for a bee to process and learn because it's similar to what they might already know how to do. And so I ran a very similar experiment to the light tunnel experiment, but this time just using vibrations. So instead of an LED tunnel, I mounted a speaker underneath my apparatus at the tunnel section. So when the bee entered the tunnel, I would give it different durations of vibration before releasing them into the decision chamber. And this time, the bees would have to associate the vibration with a color. I had 3 different conditions in this experiment, which just means I had 3 different things I wanted to test. The first 2, I wanted to know if they could tell the difference between the presence and absence of vibration. In other words, 0 versus 3 seconds, could they tell it apart? And could they use this information to make a decision? In my third condition, I wanted to know if they could tell apart different durations, so 1 versus 3 seconds. And I also wanted to know if the frequency of the vibration affected the learning. So I tested them at 68 hertz frequency and also 250 hertz frequency. What I found again was that bees did not seem to be able to tell apart different durations of vibration. So the blue line that's sloping upwards, that's my color task. So that's like a control to compare with the other conditions. You can see all the other lines are horizontal, they're all flat. which suggests they didn't improve on the task over time. And that was really interesting because I spent 2 years vibrating bees and they didn't seem to learn anything. The main thing I learned was that it seems to be really hard to train bees using vibration signals, which, as far as I know, nobody else has ever done that before. And again, I saw no evidence that bees could pay attention to the different durations of vibrations that I use. So where does that leave me? Well, I always come back to this question: do honeybees have a time sense at short time scales? I think probably, but at the very least, it doesn't seem like it's very easy to learn compared to other types of information. We know bees are really good at learning colors and smells, but seems like they're not so good at paying attention to durations. So clearly, they can use time information to make certain decisions, but maybe this is only in specific situations like the waggle dance. And some of my other experiments from my PhD also support this. So here's a quick example of what I mean. This is a simple experiment where I try to train bees to tell apart a yellow and a gray card. And I had 4 different difficulties. So the bees would start off at the low difficulty, quite easy, yellow versus gray, but gradually the yellow got darker and darker until the task was impossible because both squares were the same. And what I found was that as the task got harder and harder, they seemed to spend less and less time on the task, showing that they appear to manage the amount of time they spend depending on the difficulty of the task. So in short, this shows that they're probably aware of and can manage how much time they spend on a specific task, depending on what that task is. So overall, time clearly does play an important role in not only the communication and decision making, but also for some reason, it seems to be really hard to train them to process time information that they might not normally pay attention to. This has been a topic that has been really fun to think about over the past 4 years. And I'm particularly interested in hearing what you all think, or whether you have some personal experiences you might have about bees and time sense. And then finally, before I finish off, I would just want to say thank you to Barry and JP, who've supported my research and helped to manage the research hives at UniMelb. Without their help, none of my research would be possible. My PhD would not have finished as smoothly as it did. So thank you so much. And yeah, I'm ready for some questions or discussion on time sense.
Okay, thanks, Leslie, and thanks for the thanks. Peter, you've got a question, please.
Yes, Leslie, when the vibrations are occurring in the waggle dance, are they always the same frequency regardless of how long they do that little bit?
Yes, they seem to be about the same frequency every time. Interesting thing is, like, the different behaviors have different vibration frequencies. So for the waggle dance, it seems to be about 250 hertz. But even it's complicated because even within the waggle dance, different components of the dance are associated with different frequencies as well. So there's a lot going on.
Because usually the waggle dance is done in the dark, so one assumes it has to be more not really that visual.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It has to be something to do with either the sound or the vibration. And well, I would have thought that they would be quite sensitive to vibrations. which is why I ran the vibration experiments. But yeah, it's interesting. I've also thought that maybe because I'm vibrating the bees outside the hive, that context kind of changes the way they perceive the signal. Within the hive, they might see vibration as more of a communication thing, but outside the hive, maybe they view it as more of a predator threat, and it might be hard for them to learn.
Okay, thank you.
Judy, you've raised your hand. Did you have a question?
Yeah, more sort of a comment, I think. I've always understood that the waggle dance and the distance was more communicated, not necessarily in time, but in the amount of energy it takes to get there, if that makes sense. So the bee will communicate not, it takes like 5 minutes from this point to the actual food source. That's how I always understood that worked, but that could just be me.
No, there's that's pretty spot on. There's a lot of different factors. So the bee will figure out how far they have to fly based on different things like energy consumption and optic flow, which is how much visual change is occurring as they fly to a landmark. But then to actually communicate, to condense all this information and to communicate to the other bee, they have to code it in waggle phase. So it's all connected.
Yeah.
Leslie, and I was wondering, are you going to continue on with this line of research, and what specifically are you going to focus on?
I don't really know, but right now I'm enjoying my time at Monash. We're now primarily working on numerical cognition, so doing a lot of stuff, bees and numbers. So that's been really interesting. I'm not sure if I want to jump straight into a postdoc, and I've thought about it for a long time, but I guess it'd be interesting to think of like what question I want to pursue in the future as well. There's a lot to learn still in this time sense topic that I could keep working on.
Okay, look, Leslie, I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of everyone to thank you for your excellent presentation. You explained it very, very clearly, and it'll be very, very easy for people who weren't able to come tonight to go and have a look at the movie and can understand it quite well from your presentation. So once again, thank you very much.